I never thought I'd be sharing this story. Part of me still wants to forget it ever happened, but I need to warn others. What I'm about to tell you occurred over the span of 4 months, and it still haunts me every single day. I've changed some names and details for obvious reasons, but everything else is exactly as it happened. It started last September when my landlord raised my rent by 40%. I was already living paycheck to paycheck, working 2 jobs, and drowning in student debt. After a week of panic attacks and endless job searches, I did something I never thought I would. I made an account on a sugar daddy dating website. I told myself it was temporary, just until I got back on my feet. The first few profiles I saw were exactly what you'd expect. Creepy old men making explicit demands. But then I found Daniel's profile. Daniel Sweet, even his name sounded refined. His photos showed a distinguished man in his late 40s with short dark hair and kind eyes. His bio was different too. No mentions of arrangements or expectations, just genuine interest in meeting someone special. I had some amateur shots on my profile, and when we matched, his first message was about my photography hobby. He asked thoughtful questions and never once mentioned money. After a week of chatting, he suggested dinner at Le Blanc, the kind of restaurant I'd only seen in magazines. I remember standing outside the restaurant that first night, hands shaking as I smoothed down my thrift store dress. But Daniel made everything feel easy. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with quiet confidence. No wedding ring, no sleazy comments, just genuine conversation and impeccable manners. That first date turned into weekly meetings. Each time he'd have a small gift. A vintage camera he'd found at an auction, a rare book I'd mentioned wanting to read. The money came later, so naturally I barely noticed at first. He'd casually mention my student loans, then send a little something to help. The amounts grew larger, but he never asked for anything in return. "You're too special to rush," he'd say whenever I felt guilty about accepting his generosity. "I just want to take care of you." Looking back, I should have seen the red flags. But when you're drowning and someone throws you a lifeline, you don't inspect it for frays. You just grab on and hold tight. The first strange thing I noticed was his relationship with food. Despite suggesting the most expensive restaurants, he never ate during our dates. Always the same excuse: strict diet, already ate, not feeling well. But he loved watching me eat. He'd order elaborate courses and lean forward slightly, eyes focused on my mouth as I tasted each dish. I rationalized it as a rich person's eccentricity. Maybe he had some medical condition he was private about. After all, he was still the perfect gentleman. Until he wasn't. The shift was so gradual I almost missed it. It started with innocent questions about my daily routine. What did I eat for breakfast? Who was I having lunch with? What time would I be home? Then came the demands. Subtle at first, then increasingly firm. "You shouldn't eat processed foods," he'd say, his tone gentle but his eyes hard. "I care about your health, your purity." 3 months in, he invited me to his house for the first time. It was a beautiful Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, perfectly maintained but somehow cold. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Sweet but metallic, like copper pennies dipped in honey. He said it was a special air freshener imported from Europe. That night, he cooked for me. I wasn't allowed in the kitchen. "A surprise," he said with that perfect smile. The meal was exquisite, meat so tender it practically melted. But something felt off. Maybe it was the wine, but I felt dizzy and disconnected. I woke up in his bed hours later, fully clothed but with no memory of falling asleep. It became a pattern. Dinner at his house, always his cooking, always that strange dizziness. He started preparing meals for me to take home, insisting I eat only what he provided. "I want you healthy," he'd say. "Clean." My best friend Megan noticed the changes first. "You look pale. she said over coffee. And you've lost weight. Are you sure this guy is safe? I defended Daniel, of course. Showed her the expensive gifts and the bank transfers. He just cares about health and fitness, I said. But Megan wasn't convinced. She started digging, asking questions about his background. 3 days later, she stopped answering her phone. I'd like to say I immediately suspected Daniel when Megan disappeared. But the truth is, I didn't want to see it. Even when her family filed a missing persons report. Even when her car was found abandoned at a park across town. Even when Daniel's only response was, "These things happen in big cities." But something had shifted. Maybe it was losing Megan, or maybe the fog of infatuation was finally lifting. I started noticing things, the way he'd watch me eat like a scientist observing an experiment. The locked basement door. The fact that I'd never seen another person at his house. Not even staff, despite its size. Last week, Daniel had to leave for a business meeting. Usually, he'd have someone drive me home if he had to step out, but this time he was in a hurry. Said I could stay and wait for him. As soon as his car pulled away, I started searching. The basement door was solid oak with 3 locks. I'd taken a lock-picking course in college for photography because some abandoned buildings required creative access. It took 20 minutes, but I got it open. The temperature dropped at least 20 degrees as I went down the stairs. Motion sensors triggered fluorescent lights, revealing what looked like an industrial kitchen. But something was wrong. The refrigerator was massive, and there was that smell again, stronger now. Sweet, metallic. I wish I could say I walked away then, but I didn't. I opened the fridge. The shelves were lined with vacuum-sealed packages, each one labeled with a woman's name and date. Some labels included notes: tender, sweet, pure. On the counter, mason jars filled with what looked like preserved specimens. Teeth, fingers, small jewelry items. Megan's silver bracelet, the one her grandmother gave her, was sitting in one of those jars. I don't remember screaming, but I must have because suddenly Daniel was there. He didn't look angry, just disappointed. "I wanted to wait," he said softly. "You were going to be my masterpiece. The others were practice, but you..." He touched my face. His hand smelled like latex and that sickly sweet metal. "I've been preparing you for months, getting all the toxins out, making you pure." He told me everything. How he selected women from sugar dating sites. How he slowly conditioned their bodies with specific diets. How he preserved certain parts to remember them by. "The meat is just a bonus," he said. "What I really crave is the essence, the purity." I'd like to say I fought bravely. The truth is, survival instinct is a hell of a thing. When he turned to get his special wine, I grabbed the nearest object, a cast iron pan, and swung as hard as I could. I ran, called 911 from my car. But when the police arrived, the basement was empty, spotless. No fridges, no jars, no evidence. Daniel Sweet disappeared. His house was registered to a shell company. His photos matched no known person. The police filed a report, but without evidence. That was 2 weeks ago. Yesterday, I received a text from an unknown number. "I miss your taste. I'm leaving the country tomorrow, starting over somewhere new. But I had to share this warning if you're desperate enough to try sugar dating. Remember, some things are worse than being broke." I should have known it was too good to be true. That's what everyone says after, right? But when you're drowning in student debt, working 2 jobs, and eating ramen for the 3rd week straight, too good to be true starts to look a lot like, maybe this is finally my break. I met Victor Hale on one of those sugar dating apps I'd downloaded in a moment of desperation. His profile stood out immediately. Not because of the wealth he displayed, though there was plenty of that, but because of how normal he seemed. His photos showed a man in his early 40s, distinguished but not flashy. Brown hair, light green eyes, and a charming smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. We chatted for weeks before meeting. He asked about my studies, my dreams, my struggles. Unlike other men on the app, he never pushed for photos or made suggestive comments. When we finally met for coffee, he was exactly as his pictures showed, elegant, articulate, and disarmingly genuine. "I have a proposition for you," he said during our third meeting. "I own a private resort on an island in the South Pacific. Nothing commercial, just a place where I entertain friends and business associates. I'm hosting a small gathering next month, and I'd love for you to join us." I must have looked skeptical, because he quickly added, "No strings attached, Angelina. There will be other young women there. Think of it as a networking opportunity. All expenses paid, of course." He showed me photos on his phone. Pristine beaches, luxurious villas, infinity pools overlooking turquoise waters. "You can leave whenever you want," he assured me. "I'll have my jet ready at your convenience." I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why a successful businessman would invite a broke college student to his private island. But all I could think about was escaping my cramped apartment, my mounting bills, my exhausting jobs. "Just 1 week," he said, sliding a first-class plane ticket across the table. "What do you have to lose?" Everything, as it turned out. I had everything to lose. The flight was exactly as promised. First class all the way to a small airport in the Pacific, then a private seaplane to the island. Victor traveled separately, explaining he had business to attend to first, but his staff would take care of everything. The island was beautiful. More beautiful than the photos, if that was possible. Lush jungle surrounded a pristine resort complex, modern buildings designed to blend with the landscape. A handful of other young women were already there, lounging by the pool or walking along the beach. The staff greeted me with fresh fruit juice and cool towels. Everything was perfect. "Your passport, please," the manager said smoothly, "for safekeeping, resort policy." I handed it over without thinking. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was drinking the welcome juice. Within an hour, I felt strange. Not drunk exactly, but disconnected, floating. The manager showed me my villa. "Rest," she said. "Dinner is at 8. I lay down for what I thought would be a short nap. When I woke up, it was dark outside. My phone was gone. Something was very, very wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you'd expect at a luxury resort, but something heavy and artificial. No birds or insects. No distant sounds of other guests or staff. My head felt fuzzy as I stumbled to the bathroom. The clock on the wall said 3:47 a.m. I'd slept for nearly 12 hours. My phone wasn't on the nightstand where I'd left it. Neither was my purse or the small carry-on I'd brought. The villa's phone worked, but only for internal calls. The front desk answered immediately despite the hour. "Is everything all right, Miss Walker?" "My phone, my things, all personal belongings are secured in our safe for your privacy and comfort. Resort policy. Is there something specific you need?" Their voice was pleasant but robotic. When I asked to speak to Victor, they said he hadn't arrived yet. When I asked about getting my phone back, they assured me it would be returned at an appropriate time. I tried to go back to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness. Through my window, I could see other villas, their lights dim. In one window, a woman stood motionless, staring out into the darkness. Something about her posture seemed off, like a puppet with loose strings. At sunrise, I decided to explore. The grounds were immaculate, every plant perfectly trimmed, every path spotless. The pool water was crystal clear but had a strange, chemical smell that wasn't quite chlorine. I saw other guests, all young women like me, beautiful, well-dressed, and wrong. They moved slowly and spoke in monotones. Their eyes were glazed, pupils dilated despite the bright sun. "Isn't it paradise?" one girl said when I tried to talk to her. Her words were slurred slightly. "They take such good care of us here." "How long have you been here?" I asked. She frowned like the question confused her. "I don't remember. Does it matter? It's paradise." At breakfast, everything was served to us. No buffet or menu choices. The food was excellent but tasted slightly medicinal. I pretended to eat while watching the staff. They moved with military precision, always watching, always noting who ate and who didn't. I tried to walk to the beach, thinking I might see other boats or islands. A staff member appeared almost immediately. "I'm sorry, Miss Walker. That area doesn't have proper clearance yet. For your safety, please remain in the designated zones." "I'd like to leave," I said firmly. "Please arrange transport back to the mainland." Her smile never wavered. "I'll need to check with management. Please return to your villa and someone will contact you shortly." No one did. That's when I noticed the cameras. Dozens of them, hidden in trees behind artwork, even disguised as architectural features. All moving, all watching. At lunch, a server dropped a napkin while clearing my barely touched plate. When I picked it up, I saw writing on it. "Don't drink anything they give you. Don't let them know you know." When I looked up, the server was gone. That night, I lay in bed fully dressed, pretending to sleep. At exactly 2 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. The soft click of doors, muffled sounds of movement. I cracked my door open slightly and saw them carrying someone. One of the girls from dinner, completely unconscious. They took her toward a building I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden by tropical plants. I waited until they were gone, then followed. What I found there would haunt me forever. The building looked medical from the outside. Modern, sterile, with small high windows. The door should have been locked, but someone had left it slightly ajar. Inside, the resort's luxury fuss had vanished completely. The halls were institutional, lined with numbered doors. Through small windows, I could see rooms filled with medical equipment. Some had beds with restraints. In one room, rows of safes lined the walls. Each had a name tag. I found mine. Walker Angelina, USA. Inside would be my passport, phone, everything they'd taken, for safekeeping. But it was the next room that made my blood run cold. It looked like a shipping office. Manifests lined the walls, each listing containing names, ages, physical descriptions, and destinations. On a whiteboard, upcoming shipments were scheduled. Some names I recognized, girls I'd seen at dinner. A computer was still on, its screen showing what looked like an auction website. But they weren't selling goods. The listings showed photos of women. Some from the resort, some I didn't recognize. Each had specifications listed like they were products: height, weight, education, special skills. Current bid on one girl, $1.2 million. I heard voices approaching and ducked into a supply closet. Through the slats, I saw 2 men in suits walking past. "The Saudi prince is arriving tomorrow. He's particularly interested in the new American girl." Walker. "Yes, Victor said she's perfect for his tastes. Educated, cultured, no immediate family. The usual background check came up clean." "What's her price?" "Starting at $2 million. Her photos already have significant interest." They passed, discussing me like I was a car at auction. I waited until their voices faded, then ran. Not to my villa, they checked there first. Instead, I headed for the jungle behind the resort. I had no plan, no supplies, no idea what was on this island, but anything was better than staying. I made it about 50 yards before a dart hit me. As I fell, I saw figures emerging from the trees. They'd been waiting. They'd probably been watching since I left my room. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was, "Sedate her properly this time. Victor wants her fresh for tomorrow's showing." That's when Victor finally reappeared. He wasn't the charming man from the coffee shop anymore. His smile was cold, his eyes calculating as he checked my restraints. I really wished you just played along, Angelina. The drugs are much less effective when you resist them. But don't worry, we'll have you properly prepared for your new owner soon. The resort was just a front, a processing center for what he called specialized companion services. Rich men from around the world paid millions for young women who met their exact specifications. The resort allowed them to evaluate their purchases in person while maintaining plausible deniability. You should be flattered, he said, checking my IV. Prince Abdullah specifically requested someone with your qualities: education, refinement, innocence. Once the conditioning is complete, you'll live in unimaginable luxury. As a slave, I spat. As a companion, he corrected smoothly. One who will gradually forget any other life ever existed. The drugs are quite effective that way. Ask any of our other guests, they're quite happy now. The prince arrives tomorrow evening, Victor continued. We'll begin your final conditioning now. When you wake up, all these unfortunate concerns will be behind you. He nodded to someone behind me. I felt a cold sensation spreading from my IV. But they'd made a mistake. The server who'd warned me, she'd done more than just drop a note. While pretending to adjust my pillows earlier, she'd loosened one of my restraints. Not enough to notice during a casual check, but enough. I waited until Victor left, waited until the drugs should have knocked me out. Then I pulled my hand free. The IV came out first, then the other restraints. My head was spinning. Whatever they'd given me was strong, but adrenaline is stronger. The door was locked, but the server had thought of that too. A key card was hidden under my mattress. The halls were empty. Shift change maybe, or just overconfidence that their drugs would work. I made it to the exit, used the card one last time and ran. I went deep into the jungle, fighting through undergrowth, following the slope upward. If there was any hope of rescue, I needed height. Needed to see where I was. Needed to find some way to signal for help. Behind me, alarms began to sound. I ran until my legs gave out, then crawled. The jungle was dense and dark, but through gaps in the canopy I could see stars. I followed them north, remembering basic navigation from a survival course I'd taken as an elective. That's when I saw the metal skeleton of an old radio tower, rising above the trees. It was rusted and abandoned, but some of the equipment was still there. Solar panels suggested it had been used relatively recently, maybe as a backup system. I heard dogs in the distance. Flashlight beams swept through the trees. The climb nearly killed me. The tower swayed in the wind, rust flaking under my hands, but I made it to the small platform near the top. The radio equipment was old but simple. Basic emergency broadcast system. The solar-powered battery still showed some charge. I hit every button, turned every dial, pressed the broadcast button and screamed coordinates I'd memorized from the shipping manifests. Help, this is Angelina Walker. I'm being held at... Something hit the tower. The whole structure shuddered. They were shooting at me. I don't remember falling. The impact knocked me out, but somehow I didn't die. The dense jungle canopy broke my fall. I woke up to the sound of boat engines and unfamiliar voices. Through blurry vision, I saw an old fishing boat approaching the island's hidden dock. The crew had heard my broadcast and called it into their company. What happened next is still confusing. I was barely conscious, but I remember being pulled aboard. I remember the fishermen's horrified faces as they saw the state I was in, and the resort's security boats approaching fast. But the fishing boat was already moving, its captain ignoring the resort's radio calls. He'd seen enough to know something was very wrong. They got me to the mainland, to a hospital. I told my story to the police, to the FBI, to anyone who would listen. But Victor had planned for this too. The island didn't officially exist. No flight records showed me leaving the country. My passport was gone, along with any evidence I'd ever been there. The police acted strange during my interviews. Some seemed genuinely concerned, but others, their eyes would glaze over slightly, just like the girls at the resort. They'd suddenly change the subject or forget what we were discussing. The hospital found traces of unknown drugs in my system, but the samples mysteriously disappeared before they could be properly analyzed. The fishing boat captain who saved me died in a tragic accident 2 weeks later. I tried going to the media, but no one would touch the story. One journalist seemed interested, started investigating, then suddenly dropped all contact. When I finally found her, she had no memory of ever meeting me. That was 6 months ago. I'm hiding now, moving frequently, using cash only. I see Victor sometimes. On TV, at charity events, always with beautiful young women by his side. Their eyes are vacant, their smiles empty. The resort is still operating, still posting carefully filtered photos of a tropical paradise, still attracting desperate young women with promises of luxury and adventure. I never planned to become a sugar baby. The whole concept seemed sketchy and dangerous to me, something that happened to other people, but never to someone like me. I was raised in a middle-class family in suburban Minnesota, got decent grades, and had what most would consider a normal life. But then my mom got sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave her 6 months, maybe less. Insurance covered the basics, but the experimental treatments that might have given her a fighting chance. Those cost more money than our entire family had ever seen. My dad had already remortgaged the house. My college fund was gone. I was working 3 jobs while trying to finish my degree, and it still wasn't enough. That's when my roommate Deborah mentioned a website to find a sugar daddy. She'd been on it for a year, using it to pay for grad school. "It's not what you think," she told me one night as I sat crying over another medical bill. "Most of these men just want company, someone to talk to and spoil. The smart ones know better than to expect anything inappropriate." I made my profile at 3 a.m. after another sleepless night of watching my bank account drain faster than I could fill it. I was honest, probably too honest. I wrote about my mom, about my desperation, about how I'd never done anything like this before. I figured transparency was the best policy. If someone was going to help me, they should know exactly what they were getting into. The responses came quickly. Most were exactly what you'd expect. Crude messages from men old enough to be my grandfather, explicit offers that made my skin crawl. But then there was James. His message was different, professional, compassionate. He said he'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago and understood what I was going through. He offered to meet for coffee, just coffee, in a public place to discuss how he might be able to help. James turned out to be in his early 50s, tall and fit with graying temples and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He wore a simple but expensive-looking suit and carried himself with quiet confidence. No wedding ring, no obvious red flags. He listened intently as I awkwardly explained my situation and asked thoughtful questions about my mom's treatment options and my own goals. "I'd like to help," he said finally. "No strings attached. We can set up a regular arrangement, monthly support to help with your mother's treatments. All I ask is that we meet once a week for dinner. Just dinner and conversation. Nothing more." It seemed too good to be true. But when he transferred the first payment right there at the coffee shop, enough to cover an entire round of experimental treatments, I almost cried with relief. The first few weeks were perfect. James was a gentleman in every sense of the word. We met at upscale restaurants where he insisted on ordering the finest wines and dishes. He asked about my classes, my family, my hopes for the future. He never tried to touch me inappropriately or pressure me for anything more than conversation. The money appeared in my account like clockwork. My mom started her treatments. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Then Deborah disappeared. It happened suddenly. One day she was there, getting ready for a date with her own sugar daddy, a man she'd been seeing for several months, and the next, nothing. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her social media accounts went dark. The police said there was no sign of foul play, that adults had the right to disappear if they wanted to. But Deborah wouldn't have just left. She was 3 weeks away from defending her thesis. Her cat was still in the apartment. Her laptop, her whole life's work, was still on her desk. When I mentioned it to James, his reaction was odd. Just for a moment, something flashed behind those kind eyes. Something cold. Sugar relationships can be unpredictable, he said. Sometimes people just need to start fresh. That's when I started noticing other things. Small things. The way he always seemed to know where I'd been, even when I hadn't told him. The black SUV I sometimes spotted, parked outside my apartment. The fact that every time I tried to research his background, I found nothing. No social media, no company records, no trace of the wife he'd supposedly lost to cancer. But I couldn't walk away. Not with my mom's treatments finally showing progress. Not with the stack of medical bills that still needed paying. So I stayed. And that's when things started getting strange. Really strange. It started with the gifts. Small things at first. Expensive perfumes, designer clothes, jewelry that probably cost more than my car. But there was something off about them. The perfumes all had this peculiar undertone, something sweet but chemical. The clothes were exactly my size, even though I'd never told him my measurements. The jewelry, well, that's where things got weird. The first piece was a delicate gold bracelet with a tiny charm. It reminded me of you, James said. But when I looked closer at the charm, I realized it was a tooth. A human tooth cast in gold. I tried to laugh it off as creepy but artistic. James just smiled the perfect smile and said, "Every piece tells a story." Then came the photos. I'd wake up to find them in my email, pictures of me going about my day, getting coffee, walking to class, sitting in the library. Always from a distance. Always when I thought I was alone. When I confronted James, he seemed genuinely confused. "I worry about your safety," he said. "The city can be dangerous for young women. I have people who keep an eye on you, that's all. For protection." I should have run then, but Mom's treatments were working. The tumors were shrinking. The doctors were using words like promising and responding well. I couldn't risk losing that lifeline. Instead, I started noticing more, like how other sugar babies in our area kept disappearing, not just Deborah. Every few weeks, another profile would vanish from the website. Another young woman would go missing. The police said there was no connection, but I started keeping track. 7 disappearances in 3 months. All women in their early 20s. All involved in sugar relationships. All gone without a trace. I tried to dig deeper into James' background, used every research skill I'd learned in college. But it was like he didn't exist before 5 years ago. Even his credit card payments went through a maze of shell companies. Then I met Lisa. She approached me after one of my classes looking nervous. "You're James' new girl, right?" she asked. When I nodded, she pressed a piece of paper into my hand. "Be careful. Look up these names." The paper had 3 names, 3 women, all former sugar babies, all missing. But here's the thing that really got to me. All 3 had been seen with James. There were photos, social media posts, restaurant receipts. Different names for him each time, but the same man. My James. When I got home that night, I found my apartment door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but things were different. Subtle changes. My photos rearranged. My clothes reorganized. A new perfume bottle on my dresser, that same sweet chemical smell. And on my pillow, a small box. Inside was another gold charm for my bracelet. Another tooth. I tried to contact Lisa the next day, but her number was disconnected. Her social media was gone. like she'd never existed. James acted like nothing was wrong. Our weekly dinners continued. The money kept flowing. Mom's treatments progressed. But now I noticed new things about him. The way he never seemed to age or change. The strange scars on his hands that appeared and disappeared. The fact that he knew things about my conversations that he couldn't possibly have heard. One night, after too much wine, I asked him about Deborah. His eyes did that thing again, that flash of coldness. She served her purpose, he said. Then he smiled and changed the subject. I started planning my escape. Quietly researched new hospitals for Mom. Looked into witness protection. But James was always one step ahead. You know, he said during one dinner, loyalty is very important to me. Your mother's treatments are quite expensive. It would be a shame if anything interrupted them. The threat was clear. I was trapped. But I didn't know how trapped until I found the USB drive. The USB drive was hidden in Deborah's old room, taped under her desk drawer. I found it while finally cleaning out her things. 3 months after her disappearance, her parents had given up hope and asked me to pack up her belongings. I almost missed it, but as I was checking the drawers one final time, my fingers caught on something. The drive was tiny, wrapped in a note with just 2 words. Find him. What I found on that drive still haunts me. Deborah had been investigating James, or whatever his real name was, for months. She'd created an entire digital web of connections, missing persons reports, and newspaper articles dating back 30 years. The pattern was always the same. He'd appear in a city, using various names, but always following the same pattern. Wealthy, charming older man seeks young women through sugar dating sites. He'd build relationships with multiple girls simultaneously, always choosing ones with significant financial pressures, medical bills, family emergencies, student debt. Then, one by one, the women would vanish. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. The earliest photos of him from newspapers in the 1990s showed the exact same man. Not similar, identical. Same face, same smile, same crinkles around his eyes. He hadn't aged a day in 30 years. Deborah had tracked at least 60 disappearances linked to him across 12 states. She'd found property records under various aliases, all showing the same pattern. Large isolated houses with extensive basement renovations. She'd even managed to get blueprints for some of them. The basements all had the same unusual features: reinforced walls, advanced air filtration systems, and something labeled as preservation chambers. But the worst part was the medical records. Deborah had somehow accessed files from private clinics across the country. Records of experimental anti-aging treatments, research into cellular regeneration, studies on human tissue preservation, and blood work, dozens of samples, all from young women with specific genetic markers. Women like Deborah. Women like me. The last file was a video. Deborah had recorded it 2 days before she disappeared. She looked terrified. "If you're watching this," she said, "I'm probably dead. Or worse. He's not a normal human, not anymore. The treatments changed him. He needs us to maintain his condition. Our blood, our tissue, our essence. He preserves parts of us to sustain himself, to stay young." She went on to explain that she'd discovered his current operation, a network of private clinics performing experimental cancer treatments that required young, healthy donors. Treatments that no one ever seemed to survive. The video ended with Deborah looking directly into the camera. "If you're seeing this, you're probably his next target. Get out. Get out now before..." The video cut off. I sat there in the dark, my whole body shaking. All those disappearances, all those missing women, the tooth charms, the strange medical facilities, the way he never aged. My mom's miracle treatments. I checked the name of the clinic where she was being treated. It matched one from Deborah's files. My phone buzzed. A text from James. Found anything interesting in Deborah's things? We should talk about it over dinner tomorrow. Your mother's next treatment is scheduled for Friday. Would be a shame to miss it. The timestamp showed he'd sent it exactly when I'd opened the USB drive. He'd been watching. I went to dinner the next night. What choice did I have? Mom's next treatment was in 2 days, and according to her doctors, stopping now could undo all her progress. But I came prepared. Tiny recorder in my purse, GPS tracker activated on my phone, and a small canister of pepper spray that felt woefully inadequate. James chose a new restaurant this time, an exclusive place on the top floor of the city's tallest building. Private elevator, no other customers. Just us and a handful of staff who never quite looked me in the eye. Deborah was always too curious for her own good, he said as soon as we sat down. No pretense, no warm smile, just cold efficiency. Like you're becoming. He proceeded to tell me everything, not because he was sloppy or overconfident, but because he knew I couldn't do anything about it. He'd been born in 1847, a doctor who became obsessed with immortality after losing his family to tuberculosis. Decades of research led him to a discovery, a way to preserve youth and extend life through the absorption of certain biological markers found in young, healthy women. The sugar daddy arrangement is really quite perfect, he explained, swirling his wine but never drinking it. It gives me access to ideal candidates, women who need money desperately enough to overlook red flags, women who often don't have close family ties, women who won't be missed immediately. The treatments worked, he said. Each donation bought him another few years of youth, but the process was ongoing. He needed regular supplements. Your friend Deborah, he said, was particularly compatible. She's helped me maintain this appearance for nearly 6 months now. The way he said help it, present tense, made my stomach turn. As for your mother's treatments, he continued, they're quite real. Cancer treatment research has been a convenient cover for my work for decades. And your mother is responding well because she's receiving specialized care. Care derived from donors like Deborah. He reached across the table and took my hand. His skin was cool and felt somehow wrong. Too smooth, too perfect. You have the same markers, he said. Better ones, actually. Deborah's research helped me confirm that. You could help so many people, including your mother. All those other women, they're part of something greater now. They live on through the people they save. I pulled my hand away. They didn't choose that. Choice is a luxury for those who have options. He smiled, and for the first time, I saw what he really was. Something evil wearing a man's face. Do you have options? That's when I noticed the sweet, chemical smell. The same scent from the perfumes he'd given me. It was coming from my wine glass. Don't worry, he said as my vision began to blur. I have a very specific process. You won't feel anything, and your mother will receive the best care until her natural end. I promise you that. The last thing I remember was him catching me as I slumped forward, his too perfect face swimming in my vision as he whispered, "You're going to help so many people." I woke up in a basement. The basement was exactly like the blueprints from Deborah's files. Sterile white walls, bright fluorescent lights, the soft hum of air filtration systems, and the preservation chambers, large cylindrical tanks filled with pale blue liquid. I wasn't restrained. I didn't need to be. Heavy steel doors, no windows, no way out. But Deborah had left me more than just research. That last video had contained coded information, little details that only made sense now that I was here. She'd found weaknesses in his system. The preservation chambers required massive amounts of power. Emergency protocols required backup generators with manual switches. Switches that, if triggered in the right sequence, would cause a system-wide shutdown. I had been given a change of clothes, plain white medical scrubs. In the pocket, I found a key card, not mine. One of the staff's, slipped to me during dinner by a server who'd finally met my eyes. Not everyone who worked for him did so willingly. For 3 days, I played along, let them take blood samples, listened to James explain how special I was, how much good my contribution would do, watched as they prepared the preservation chamber that would become my permanent home. I learned the staff schedules, the security patterns, the location of every camera. On the 4th day, they brought in someone new, another girl unconscious, pretty, young, desperate, probably like all the others. That night, I made my move. The key card got me into the generator room. The emergency protocols were exactly where Deborah said they'd be. 3 switches, 5 seconds apart. The lights went out. The backup power kicked in, but it could only handle essential systems, not the cameras, not the electronic locks, not the preservation chambers. The alarms were deafening. In the chaos, I ran, upstairs through corridors I'd memorized, past panicking staff trying to prevent their preserved samples from degrading. I found Deborah in one of the tanks, still perfectly preserved, suspended in that pale blue liquid. Still young, still beautiful, still helping others like James had said. Just not in the way she would have chosen. I couldn't save her. Couldn't save any of them. But I could make sure everyone knew. Deborah's research, the videos, the evidence, it was all uploaded to secure servers, set to release to police departments and news outlets across the country if I didn't enter code every 24 hours. I made it out. Made it to the police. Made it to the FBI. But they found nothing. By the time they raided the facility, everything was gone. The chambers, the bodies, James. Like it had never existed. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you want more tales like this, hit like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.